All right. Well, we've got a couple more people joining. We've got a couple more people who I'm communicating with. The link is apparently slightly different than what I sent out because we've switched to a new format. But we're going to go ahead and get started anyway because we've got a couple new things to share this time around. Well, let me first introduce myself. My name is Mike Hess. I'm the Senior Director of Public Outreach and Education for the COPD Foundation. Many of you on the call today know me, but one of the new features we're trying for Oxy Talk this year to try and build out our audience a little bit better, excuse me, is we are actually recording these sessions from now on. So that we can share them with the community and we can improve access to this kind of information because we know that a lot of these issues or a lot of the educational issues out there are just, it's difficult to get access to a lot of information. So that's part of my role at the foundation is to lead our Oxygen 360 project so that we can try and improve a lot of these things. This is now, I believe we're starting our third year of Oxy Talks, or a year and a half, 2.5 years, 3 years, something like that. But we do these sessions monthly, tied in with our educational calendar at the foundation so that we can share the information, not only from the clinical side of things, I'm an RT by training, but also from people who actually walk the walk. Those of you maybe watching the recording here can see a lot of our team here, a lot of our attendees are oxygen users themselves, and they are gracious enough to share their experiences to anybody who has questions about the experience of living with oxygen therapy. I'll also take a moment to introduce my partner in crime on the Oxygen 360 team, John Linnell, one of those very patient experts. All right. So, as we get started here, as I mentioned, we are starting to tie these in a little bit more closely with our educational calendar at the foundation. We'll be starting to see that particularly next month with February session, which we'll talk about as we get toward the end here. But this month at the COPD Foundation, a lot of our educational efforts are focused toward people who might be new to COPD or to oxygen, excuse me. And just bear with me a moment because there's another email from somebody trying to get access. That's really what I want to start talking about today. In these Oxy Talks, we usually have a session where we have some of the educational content, and then of course we want to make sure that we save plenty of time for questions from all the attendees. And of course, we've got a relatively small group today, so we should have plenty of time for that. But I have no doubt that by the end of the year, we're going to have a rocking and rolling good time here on the Oxy Talk. So, with that said, as we continue to get a couple people in here, one thing I would like well, I guess I'll start for a little bit. I'll have my clinician privilege, I guess, for a moment. Um, One of the things I know that we have an issue with in healthcare is trying to get people to understand why they are prescribed oxygen therapy, how they should use oxygen therapy, and kind of all those ins and outs. So one of the things that I always like to start with is trying to understand or trying to explain why you might be prescribed oxygen therapy. And the first part of that is essentially that your lungs are not as great at getting oxygen from the air into the bloodstream and then into your organs. Um, John, can you do a really great job of explaining like the role of oxygen therapy and the role of oxygen in the cells. Can you take a minute and kind of explain to folks again who might be watching on the recording here, why oxygen is so important to life?
Well, sure. I basically just tell people oxygen is the fuel that your muscles use, just as gasoline or diesel is to an automobile. And if you're out of tune, if you're out of shape, just like if a car is out of tune, it's not going to go, it will require a lot more fuel to go from point A to point B, just as you will require more oxygen to get up and walk across the room or down the sidewalk to get to the mailbox or whatever. And if you're in tune, if you exercise and you're in shape, you don't need as much. So a lot of times we wonder if do I need oxygen because my lungs are bad? Or is it a combination of my lungs are bad and I'm out of shape and I simply need more fuel. So if you tune yourself up, and I hope this is what Mike was asking me to go towards.
Exactly. Yep.
If you tune yourself up, you're not going to need as much fuel because you're working more efficiently. And that's a very simple lay explanation without getting into all the stuff that Mike as a clinician would with diffusion and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and that's actually perfect. That's what I was really hoping for, because we do still have several videos on our YouTube channel where you might be finding this particular video that kind of go into a little bit more detail. A few things that we did, John and I did a couple years ago, that have some animations and things like that kind of go into some of those details. But that's exactly what I was looking for. Now, one thing I really want to point out is there's not necessarily a really good correlation between being short of breath and having low oxygen. It's one of those things we hear a lot in our 360 social platform and a lot of our social media and all that sort of thing. Well, my oxygen level is great. It's 94, it's whatever, but I'm still short of breath. Why is that? So again, that's one of those things that I think we kind of fall down sometimes on, is teaching people that you really only know if your oxygen level is low if you have a pulse oximeter, which I know John has a couple of those probably handy. I actually got one out ready for me. One of these little devices. These are the things that stick on your finger here. I should probably pick a different finger, but it's too late now. But yeah, it's just one of those things that this measures the actual the relative amount of oxygen in your bloodstream. You've got your blood is full of red blood cells, which contain hemoglobin, and that's what carries the oxygen. And our pulse oximeter tells us how many of those are actually full with oxygen. We really want to try to keep that, generally speaking, around 90 to 92%. The formal guideline that I've just been looking at some other things here, especially internationally, I really like to keep it between 88 and 92. But I like to have a little bit of wiggle room, especially since we know that there's some inaccuracy involved in pulse oximeters these days. So I'd like to now kind of go around the horn a little bit here for anybody who's willing to share. Again, we know that a lot of our intro to oxygen stuff doesn't really come across from the clinical side. So I was wondering if you would share with us at least one thing that you wish you had kind of known from the beginning, that maybe you know now, but you wish you had known from the beginning.
To kind of jump on what John talked about in terms of oxygen being the equivalent of gasoline to a car, I think one of the things that we need to pay attention to and people need to understand is that most of the time you are prescribed oxygen because your SATs are low. And when I say SATs are low, what I mean is that as John discussed it, we're talking about not enough gas in the tank, not enough gas in the tank to make the car go where we need it to go without adding additional gas. But one of the things that I think is really important is to think about what that really means when you're talking about energy to the rest of your body. What we're really talking about is your heart, your lungs, every other organ that you own, and then certainly the muscles and the ligaments and the things that we depend on to actually make us move. All of those things need oxygen. And when we have low oxygen, the oxygen that we do have, the brain and the heart and the lungs are smart enough to send those to the things that really need it the most. The brain, the heart, that kind of thing. So things that aren't high up on the list there, that are below the cutoff line, those are the ones that get dropped. And that's why a lot of times we find ourselves with an urge to urinate, some other kinds of things that maybe aren't nearly as pleasant, but it's important to understand that so that you really know what the oxygen is doing for you, and you know what the risk is if you don't use it. I think that's really the key. It's understanding the risk if you don't use it. that is important. And lots of times people don't get that because they think that oxygen is going to help them breathe better. And that's not what it does.
I'd like to tailgate onto that for a moment. You bring up a very good point that your body kind of prioritizes things like your brain and your heart. Excuse me. But even then, sometimes it still doesn't have enough for that. And so we see people who, that's why you may have a little bit of brain fog. That's something that I've been introduced to over the last couple of weeks. I've been recovering from a COVID infection. I finally won the COVID lotto. Sadly, not the Mega Millions, but the COVID lotto. But I don't think this particular brain fog isn't necessarily due to the low oxygen issue, because I've had my trusty oximeter, but it's the same kind of concept. You still may not have enough gas in the tank, and then I've actually run out of gas one time, and you kind of have that moment where it's just kind of like chug 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 chug, and then the thing shuts down. And that's kind of where, even after your body has prioritized your central stuff, you still may run into some trouble. So that was a great explanation. Thank you, Jean.
I think one of the things that I've learned, I was diagnosed, it'll be 4 years. It has been 4 years, close. Actually 5 now that I think about it. Anyway, what was not emphasized was two things: the importance of exercise, as well as weight management. And I think those two things going together, emphasizing on exercise. But I lost quite a bit of weight in the last couple of years, and it improved my oxygen saturation tremendously. Now, that being said, I started working part-time, and so I'm moving less. So I am now not exercising as much and experiencing, just being aware that I need to get moving again because my oxygen saturation isn't as good as it used to be. So those two things really, weight management and the importance of regular, continuous exercise.
Yeah, it's kind of that time of year where it's hard to get that motivation to exercise. I was doing really well back in October when we had that 31-day challenge, and now that it's been gray for feels like 31 days, but it's been about 2 weeks. I think they were saying in the news that we've had about 5 hours of sunlight in the last 2 weeks here in Michigan. It's just hard to get that motivation sometimes to get up and moving. So, and that's me with relatively good lungs most days prior to COVID anyway. So Tom, you're kind of inspiring me there with your sitting with your bands here. Actually,
look at Tom go.
I was gonna say, I kind of feel
John got me going on that the other day.
I feel like I should be tagging along. I got a couple of hand weights here. I should be tagging along with that too.
Why not when you're just sitting here? And,
That's exactly right.
you know,
All right, so we've
I
got.
just wanted to add in though, real quick. We're talking about oxygen. Another reason to make sure that you're using oxygen as you should is if you don't, those with COPD that don't use oxygen as they should are a lot more prone to get secondary pulmonary arterial hypertension, which is also, once you have it, you have it. There is no cure. Why do you want two diseases that are going to stay with you for the rest of your life that need medication, treatment, care? So you're only hurting yourself.
Well,
Right on,
and
that's a very good point.
I usually tell people I did enough damage to my brain cells in college. I do not need to lose any more.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. I'm a little bit curious. I know a lot of times we talk about somebody getting diagnosed with low oxygen, or as we like to call it with our fancy $15 words, hypoxemia, in a physician's office or a clinic or something like that. Were any of you diagnosed in the hospital after maybe like an exacerbation or something like that, and you were new to oxygen therapy in the hospital?
You mean the initial COPD diagnosis?
Well, really more, maybe it could go either way. I mean, we know a lot of people aren't diagnosed until they have that first diagnosis because we humans are so adaptable and we just start taking the elevator instead of the stairs and all that sort of thing. And we kind of put off all our health stuff until we can't anymore. But I guess what I'm also interested in is, did anybody start their oxygen career in the hospital, or was everybody diagnosed in the clinic?
We're on.
I'm pretty sure I did. 2009, I had my first flare up. I was hospitalized for
10 days or so.
10 to 12 days.
Okay.
And then I went on, I believe I went on part-time as needed. But 2012 was when I went full-time.
Okay.
So,
what was
About time you got a full-time job.
yeah. Well, got to start sometime.
Can you tell us a little bit about that process of how did you know? I mean, they probably told you that you needed it part-time in the hospital, and then they sent you home with all the equipment. How did you know when it might be time to get rechecked to go to that full-time continuous use?
Well, 2009, I didn't go on oxygen, but I was on for 10 to 12 days. And I don't think I was on oxygen until after 2010 sometime, maybe 2012, because I was in for at least about the same amount of time again.
Gotcha.
That's when I went on part-time. My memory comes back after I talk about it some, or my wife says, no, that's this.
I've been there.
She is here, so. But then I was doing it. I ended up going on full-time because I couldn't handle it without. So, and I don't know if I was in denial or not, but I know one time this is about my mother. We went to church and my mother was probably 80 some years old, and she had a cane and she had hooked it up on the deck outside. And I says, well, what are you doing? She says, well, I don't want to see anybody see me with a cane. So I says, just a minute, mother. I took my oxygen off, was setting that up there. She says, what are you doing? I said, well, I don't want anybody to see me. She picked her cane up. So
I like
both
that.
went in.
I like that too. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that really hits one of the key things that a lot of people don't really, it is kind of that denial aspect. You don't want to look sick, et cetera, et cetera. And so, people just don't like that stigma of having medical equipment in general, but certainly something like oxygen. Louise, I want to call on you for a second. I think you were also saying something. You were muted, but I think you were also talking about initially getting diagnosed in the hospital and then kind of moving around the process there.
Yeah, I had a serious exacerbation, as you know, and I came home from the hospital on oxygen. Yeah,
and you hadn't needed it before.
I mean, I had not needed it before. They sent me home with one of those rolling tanks, and then the provider came, and that was horrible. Worst experience. I don't wish that on anybody, because there was no education about oxygen. I didn't know anything about oxygen, and I mean, you're really sick. You just get home from the hospital. This guy scares you to death about oxygen tanks blowing up. Where do you go from there? Like, I know in the past I was told that an RT used to come to explain, but then they stopped doing that because it was too expensive. Well, maybe it was worth the money. Because I just don't see, and sending people home from the hospital on oxygen, somebody should take the time to sit down with that patient and give them a crash education course or something, some kind of knowledge of why are we sending you home on oxygen? What is the importance? What does it do for you? What is it not going to do for you? Why is it important for you to use it? Nothing. There was nothing. Education is so important about every aspect.
And that's why that transition education going from hospital to home needs to begin at the
At the
hospital
hospital.
rather than going home and having a delivery man drop stuff off. Because in the hospital, you've got this metal nipple sticking out of a wall that you plug into and dial it up and down, and that's all there is to it. It's a little bit different at home. How
Yeah,
do you
it's
get
a lot
that 50,
different.
that 50-foot tubing to go up and down the stairs and not have the cat eat through it and all of the in-home issues you have?
Yeah, in the hospital, I mean, if you're gonna get out of bed to walk, they come, they unhook you from the wall, they hook you to a tank. You know, everything is done for you. There's no explanation, there's no education.
Well, just bring the respiratory therapist home with you and
Yeah, that would be ideal.
roll out a cot and say, here's where you sleep.
Unfortunately, I've also learned, I mean, I kind of knew this at some part of my, some part of my brain, but with a project that Gene was a part of earlier this year, we also had an RT who's on our community engagement committee named Dave Reynolds, and we were writing a couple of oxygen blogs, one for new oxygen users and one for clinicians. We know that there's a huge breakdown, there's a knowledge gap, even in a lot of RTs, certainly in a lot of other prescribers, your docs, your nurse practitioners, your physician assistants. But one of the things that Dave was telling me, and again, this is kind of RT to RT, that we've really got to focus on the idea that we do have distinct problems in the home, just like you're saying, John, because I think a lot of us on the clinical side also forget that it's not that little adapter with the plug into the wall there. It's the loud machine, it's the heavy tanks, it's whatever it is that we need to consider. And we do forget that. So
And even simple things like, how often should you change your cannula? How often should you change your tubing? People are not told any of that.
Yeah.
Right.
When you need a water trap, who should and who should not use a water bottle, and what are the bacterial risks in using them, and et cetera, et cetera.
Right, exactly.
And none of that is hospital related. That's all in home.
Someone I know, her oxygen equipment was dropped off and they did not leave any extra cannulas or tubing. She didn't know she was supposed to change it. She goes, what do you mean I'm supposed to change it?
With what?
Well, she's
Yeah.
got one cannula.
You gotta call them.
Sucking out of the tank.
I knew somebody in a similar situation with a nebulizer who had the same plastic nebulizer cup and that same tubing for, I think, 3 years. And then finally I met them and I took a look at it and it was cracked and it was a thing. But so given, I mean, obviously this is a pretty common problem that we're not getting that information out to the people who need it. So how
my driver told me what to do.
Oh, really? Okay.
That delivered. He was very good.
So for those of you who maybe weren't that lucky, how did you end up learning all these things? Where did you get your information from?
I got my information from a group called Efforts. And I was on oxygen for a period of time, then I was able to get off because of weight loss and exercise. But when I went back on oxygen, I had enough friends that had oxygen, and I knew a lot of people who had liquid and who had a particular kind of a delivery device, and I knew exactly what to ask for. But that's how I learned. I learned from people that I knew who were already using it. But the other thing I guess I wanted to point out, or at least I wanted to say, is that there are some things that are being done. I'm working on a study with Val Press, and one of the things that we're doing is we're working with hospitals and clinics and those kinds of places doing quality improvements. And one of the quality improvements that many of these places are choosing to use is that oxygen transition from hospital to home and how to make that better. So, there are some good things that are going on. We hope that the research will give us some really good things that we can publish so that other places can then, duplicate the kinds of things that these people who are participating in the study are doing, try and improve things. So there are some things. The other thing is I don't think I know Luke Frazier, and I'd like to know who he is.
Who's the man in
All right,
black?
we're calling you out, Luke. Oh, Luke's not going to play along with us. That's fair. This is a pretty. What's that?
So, Mike, to answer your question, where I got my education was pulmonary rehab.
Okay.
The pulmonary rehab program was 6 hours a week, 3 hours of exercise, and 3 hours of education, and it was all categorized.
But they educated you about home oxygen?
1 hour of education about oxygen, all things oxygen.
Okay, good.
And the respiratory therapist was very good and very knowledgeable. There was always a question and answer period. Yeah, I mean, it was a very, there was a whole hour on how to use your inhaler, because most people don't use them right. That's how I got my education, is I got it through pulmonary rehab.
I've got one follow-up question for that, and then I want to get to Joe, who's got waiting patiently with his hand up there. Do you think, and this isn't meant to be any kind of loaded question or anything like that, I'm honestly curious, do you think you learned more about oxygen from the RT or from the other people, your peers at pulmonary rehab who maybe were on oxygen?
I think I learned more from the RT initially.
Okay. So that's one of the things that, I personally, and then we at the foundation really like to prioritize, is trying to learning from each other, because, I've always told people, I know about COPD. I know why you're breathless. I know all these things. I can understand why that's uncomfortable and all that sort of thing, but I don't know how you feel. I can never say that I know how you feel, because I don't. And I would much rather have, for a lot of these things, I would much rather have somebody, like in a group like this, who does know how you feel, try and give those explanations. Now, also the flip side to that is, sometimes there's a lot of misinformation on all that sort of thing floating around the internet, and so sometimes we need, the clinical side of things to really kind of to guide that sort of thing. I think it's a good mix, and I'm glad that we're seeing that there is a little bit of playing off each other with learning from peers, and then also learning from clinicians. So,
well, Mike,
Joe,
I think to clarify that,
okay,
I think I learned more from the RT because everybody else was in my boat.
Oh, okay.
You know what I mean? They were all coming into pulmonary rehab for the first time. Some were also first-time oxygen users.
Right
So
on.
there was nothing there for me to learn from them. I think we all learned from the RT and eventually learned from each other.
Right on. All right, Joe, you're up. And then Tom's got his hand up now.
All right. I've got two insignificant things, but just to bring up, it's kind of stupid, but I was using oxygen for about 3 months before I knew or found out that my cannula was upside down. It was pointed up instead of backwards. Very simple. The other thing is, I think they should outlaw, and I don't know if there'd be exceptions to this, outlaw 50-foot tubing. Initial issue should be 225s with a swivel, because I didn't even find out about the swivel existence till about 6 months in. And most of my knowledge, I guess, initially anyway, was either YouTube or Google in learning about certain things. That's where I discovered there was a swivel. I called my provider, said, well, sure, we'll send you some. And the 25-foot tubing. And going back to what John started earlier about the gasoline, I was trying to make some analogy to, okay, we've got the gasoline and we're short and we need more and all. Don't forget to change the oil. And I was trying to get something to go with that. Now, I'm coming up with nutrition, but I can't make it work yet. But
Well, and if nothing else, don't forget to change your equipment. Maybe the equipment, it's the tubing and stuff. Maybe that's the oil.
well, the exercise portion is if you leave the car in the driveway with a full tank, it will rust if you don't move it.
Yes.
So you got to move it.
And
So,
a quick comment too about the swivel that he referred to. I didn't learn this for years, that if you look at the swivel, the opening, the diameter of the opening on each side is different. It's smaller on one end than it is on the other. And the smaller opening needs to be pointed towards where you're going to be, the end, where the cannula goes in. And the reason for that is, I think it's the Bernoulli effect, or it's some physics effect where you're going to get a better delivery. So you can't just willy-nilly put, you have to look carefully, but you can't just willy-nilly put a swivel on your tubing. And nobody has ever told, I don't think that's ever taught to anyone.
No, probably not.
As far as patience.
At the end of today's session, I want to throw a mucus question to the mucophile that's online with us.
Okay.
When this is all over.
All right, so Tom, I'll grab you in a minute. I do have a quick follow-up for Joe, because I'm intrigued by this. You've obviously got some pretty strong feelings about wanting to have that swivel rather than one piece of tubing. The flip side to that, I guess, and again, this is kind of looking at maybe on the inpatient side of things. We would always try to minimize failure points. We would always try to minimize the places where it could become disconnected or all that sort of thing. And that was most of our equipment, whether it was a nebulizer, whether it was a ventilator, or oxygen tubing. So what do you see as the benefit of the swivel that is so significant that you want to have that as your initial thing rather than the single piece of tubing?
And I'm just guessing, but I would imagine that a younger person, and I say younger, anybody, maybe I'll just pick a number out of the air, under 60, is probably less likely to trip than someone much older. And the risk analysis or risk benefit to me would be lower those little loops that are laying all over the floor where your foot can get tangled. That's the main thing. And it might even, and failure points, they don't mention this anywhere in any paper, official or unofficial, but I take my joints where they link, and about once a month I'll stick them in a cup of water to see if there's any bubbles. If there's no bubbles, I just keep on trucking.
And that way we can see if there's cracks or things like that in the
right. If I'm losing O2, right.
But I would argue with you that they don't really swivel. They're connectors. They allow you to link two tubes together, but they don't have like ball bearings on them where they
are
swivel.
Some do. Yeah. Some do.
Look, well, I haven't seen ones that actually swivel. I've just seen the hard white plastic one like Tom. Is yours actually swiveling?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Well, I guess I've got a pretty cheap DME then, because mine are just connectors.
Well, you got to ask for them.
There are two different kinds. There are ones that are just like that one piece.
I learned something. I love it.
That spikes on both sides, and then there are the ones that do have that swivel in the middle. So, I get that is another thing we've got to look out for. Is you've got to be specific when you're asking for these kinds of parts.
Yeah, but the trip hazard.
The trip hazard keeps the tubing from getting all tangled up or less tangled up.
Gotcha. I learned a little bit too.
My cat learned that he liked to chew the tubing, and this is recent because we've had the cat for years. So now I had to get a 50-foot length of that mesh tubing, and which is split loom tubing. And that's a long process to feed 50 feet of tubing into those things. You get corrugated fingers, and it's not pleasant, but once it does, it stops the cat.
Well, when you're ready to throw a cannula away, just plug one end, fill the middle with hot sauce, and plug the other end and give it to the cat.
There you go.
So, John, you're not alone in learning something today. I honestly didn't
No,
think that the swivel adapter would make that much difference in the floor loops, but so it's good to know that it does. So,
Yeah, if it's a swivel, not simply a connector, I'm glad I learned that.
all right, Tom, what
What
you
did
got?
you say about these swivels? Which way do they go?
Well,
Which
if
end goes-
you look at them, one end is smaller
Yes.
than the other. The opening end needs to point towards where you're going to be sucking on it.
The bigger end.
No, the smaller end needs to be pointed towards the end use of it.
Okay, so the big
I
end.
heard
The
just
larger
the
end
opposite.
should face, the larger end should face towards your concentrator.
The big end is the inlet. And the little end is the outlet,
Yes,
Yep.
Yeah.
right? I didn't know
I
that.
believe so.
But Joe, I got a swivel, 225 footers. I used it for a long time now. And I still got to untwist it.
Well, yeah, you still do, but it's
From the
minimal.
cannula to the swivel.
Yeah, it's
And I got
minimal
a-
compared
I
to
also got a
what.
swivel up by my cannula too, but
Mhm.
it
last
doesn't.
time I had
go.
a swivel, I was 2 years old. It was called a sit and spin.
But we were talking here earlier about how you learn about stuff. Yeah, in rehab, that's where I learned a lot from the RTs. But then I've probably been to rehab, I don't know, 7, 8 times through the cardiac and pulmonary. Then the RTs would tell the new people, if you need to know about oxygen, to ask me.
Right.
And some wanted to learn, but others, no, I'm okay.
Yeah,
Them were the new ones.
to go along with the rehab education. In my rehab, I went 34 out of 36 of my visits, and the 34th or the 35th and 36th were canceled because of COVID, and I never went back.
Oh,
But
that's too bad.
education, it was in a hospital setting.
Yeah.
And the education on a scale of 1 to 10, it was 0.
Right.
Mine too.
Everything,
Me
all
too.
my education was online and in
Mine
Zoom
too.
meetings and what have you.
They had no education available at all.
They might have
Yeah.
had, but they didn't give it to me or other people in the,
Really?
you know.
Oh, wow. Yeah,
Mm.
mine was structured. It was, yeah.
you know.
Pulmonary rehab is not created equal. And
No.
you were really lucky, Louise, that you had a good one.
Yeah.
I was.
With good people.
the same
And
thing.
I've seen a couple good ones, but they seem to be kind of few and far between.
And I'm very blessed that they have maintenance. I've been going for 11 years.
Good for you.
Yeah,
and-
we have
un-
maintenance every Tuesday and Thursday. And the RT is very forthcoming with information.
And
You know,
with
I
that-
mean, so it's almost like continuous education. And
without,
I love that about it. I love, you know, if there's something new, she'll talk to us about it. She goes around, checks O2. She's sent people to the doctors saying, why are you here? I hear wheezing. I hear this. Get out of here. Yeah, I'm very blessed. It's 15 minutes from my house.
Wow, that's great.
without education, I thought of the rehab that I was in as a gym with 2 monitors.
Yes.
You know, people just walking
Yes.
around monitoring other people. Otherwise, it was just a low impact gym, so to speak.
That was my
Then,
experience as well. My learning was first at 360 Social. I learned a lot there, but like Joe, I went and did my own research online, and it really was more about the equipment and what to do. When I first started, I was washing my cannula tubing and all of that stuff.
But I think that makes the problem becomes, what about, we're unique. Because we all recognize each other. We're the same ones on every call every week, or sometimes 3 or 4 times a week. What about everyone that needs this information that's not getting it? how do we get it? How do we get it to them? And that's the larger question. And
John, I hate to say
I don't
this,
have the answer.
you can lead a horse to water. You can't make him drink.
No,
Well,
but how do you
Some
lead them
people
to water?
just don't want to know. I've had people tell me I don't want to know.
Except, I think being on places like Facebook. I don't know if there's a Twitter feed or whatever, but I think the more places, at least the information is out there, the better. And then there are those folks who kind of hang out in those places and might just take a peek at
Yeah.
what the information is about.
But then I would guess the majority of people don't even have Facebook. That's the problem. But go ahead, Mike. Sorry.
Oh no, that's one of the things we're really starting to look at with Oxygen 360 this year. We've been able to start growing the program a little bit. It was a little bit different format than when we first started, but we've been able to do a little bit of research. We've been able to do some of these projects, but now, to John's point, we really need to start doing a better job of getting the information out there. That's really one of our main mandates. And, obviously, this is, we've kind of fallen off on that, admittedly, in the last, particularly probably the last 6 months or so. So that's really one of our main goals, is to really start using our social media channels. And that's why I'm very grateful to all of you for willing to kind of rehash some of this material. I know is very familiar to all of you, because my hope is, somebody watching this on our YouTube channel, or, maybe getting the link from Facebook, or we do in fact have a Twitter. We have an Instagram. I'm hearing some rumblings that we may venture into the world of TikTok this year. I don't know. I don't know how that's going to go, but well,
I think that's really good, because I think there may be, say, some younger folks on TikTok who are going to say to mom or grandma or someone else, hey, I just saw this information. Maybe this would help you.
Well, and that's really the hope. Our relatively new CEO, Gene Wright, a few years back, actually led a project down with Atrium Health, they're called now, down in the Carolinas, where it was actually a project called Kids for COPD, and it was really aimed at the kids, the grandkids, the nieces, the nephews, all those sorts of people, so that they could then take those lessons and say, hey, I saw this on, I think it was mostly on Instagram at the time, because that was the TikTok of its day. So that's, and so I think that's kind of why we're starting to kind of look into some of these new avenues to reach more people, because we do need stuff like that. We do need to have those catchy things, and those viral moments, and you never really know where they're going to hit. I mean, a lot of people on the call here probably know I'm kind of a sci-fi nerd, and I actually had one of my first arguably viral tweets last night, because I was kind of gently somebody asked what was a TV show that you would watch all over again from the beginning, just pure all the way through without knowing what happened.
Battlestar Galactica.
And I said Battlestar Galactica, but I wanted it to be the newer one, not I said the good one, not the one from the 70s. And now again, I
really thought he was something.
I grew up with the Battlestar. That's my wife, Kelly, nurse practitioner.
Hey, Kelly, come
he
say
really
hi.
thought he was something last night.
So I grew up with the cheesy old one. I loved it to death back in the day. It was a great show, but I was a big fan of the newer one, and it turns out people have thoughts about the relative merits of Battlestar Galactica, and I think I've had something like 600 likes on it, and like 50 comments, and it was just baffling to me, because I like to think I'm kind of a witty guy. I think I've had some pretty fun tweets from time to time. I've tailgated on some important clinical things. I'm trying to get some important messages out there, and I get 2 likes or, a retweet or something like that. And then here's just this silly offhand comment about a TV show. But it speaks to the point of, you really never know when you're going to be in the right place at the right time with that right message. And that's why it's so important to explore some of these new things. And because we do need to get this information out there to as broad an audience as we can. And again, that's why I just want to say thank you to all of you today for sharing your stories and for being part of that change that we want to see throughout the year here.
Speaking to TikTok,
but one of the things that really is important, and I think that the foundation probably needs to really look at this. If we're going to have a presence on social media, we need to have somebody at the foundation who's monitoring it pretty much all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise it's going to go screwy. And we don't want that. But the other thing is that, people who are now being diagnosed with COPD, people who are in their 50s, are going to be far more capable of using social media,
Yes.
far more familiar with it. They won't quite have grown up with it, but they will sure be far more familiar with it and willing to use it than I am, because I hate it.
That's a fantastic point, and that really does tie in with another one of our new directions this year. Some of this group may be clued into things like the Gold Strategy Report, and some of the journals that come out that have come out. And there's really this whole new paradigm of how we look at COPD. For so long, it was, well, it's a smoker's disease. It's this, it's that. It's a forgive me, it's an old person's disease. There's nothing you can do about it. And this year, there were a huge body of evidence came out that we're actually starting to look at different subtypes of COPD. COPD that may be due to a chronic infection. COPD that may be due to maybe you were a preemie and your lungs didn't develop properly and you never hit peak lung development. And so when you have that kind of natural decline as you get older, you get into those symptoms. Air pollution. Genetic stuff, not even, we all know, or many of us know about alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, also called genetic COPD. But there are other components to it. We know just right off the bat that COPD does tend to hit women harder than men. So there's clearly some kind of genetic component there, whether it's body composition or whether it's the genes, we don't know for sure, but a lot of that is related. So we're really emphasizing the message that this isn't just an old person's disease. Anybody is susceptible to COPD because there are so many things that we're finding out cause it. And so it's not even just the 50-year-olds, it's the 40-year-olds, and maybe even some 30-year-olds are going to start looking at this, because we also don't know what's going to happen with vaping over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. We have a lot of unanswered questions about that, particularly with people who are growing up vaping. We have no idea what's going to happen with that. So this is going to be it's going to be relevant for a lot of people for a long time. And if we can kind of get out ahead of that, again, that's really important messaging to have.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth, because when you had mentioned TikTok, I said, oh, come on. But then in reality, it's not. COPD is not just an old person's disease. And I've worked on a couple projects with, you might know the name, Dr. Francesca Polverino. She's wonderful. She was at University of Arizona and last year moved to Baylor. And we presented together at ATS in San Francisco. She was there. I was at home because I couldn't travel. But the whole focus was, it's not an old person's disease, and we've got to stop looking at it that way. I was diagnosed in my 40s, and I thought I was old. It was my physician that said, you're not old, but you have COPD.
In 2004.
So that's a great message as we start wrapping up here, as we start coming up on the top of the hour. Couple of things I want to hit on, just kind of going back to the education piece while some of the other conversation was going on. I took a moment and was Googling the swivel adapters because I was curious, and I haven't quite been able to find the actual instructions with it. But to the point of how education can be inconsistent sometimes, I found one educational handout from a very well-known, very well-established research institute that actually has a very advanced pulmonology program. This was some of their patient education materials. And then also from an online durable medical equipment supplier that, again, this was not the manufacturer instructions, but their insert. And neither of them even mentioned that the swivels were two different sizes. Even if they had a picture that was very clear that the two ends were different sizes, the instructions that came along with it didn't mention that at all. So I found that to be interesting. And then the other thing I want to throw out there, just again, as we're wrapping up here, our next month, as we have these meetings on the second Wednesday of every month at 4 p.m. Eastern time. Probably should have mentioned that at the top, but better late than never, I suppose. Next month's theme at the foundation is getting the most from your therapies, and also we'll touch a little bit on February is a National Heart Health Month. So our topic next, be on the lookout for our specific topics for OxyTalk, which will be coming out through our social media channels. We're working on a better plan for dissemination with that, and then also our newsletter. If you haven't signed up for our newsletter that comes out every couple of weeks, you can head over to copdfoundation.org and get a link on there, or you can always send us an email. You can send us an email at the oxygen360@copdfoundation.org address, or info@copdfoundation.org, and we can get you to the right place to get you signed up for those newsletters. So with all of that said, again, I want to thank everybody for coming out today and spending some of your Wednesday and sharing some fantastic information. I hope you had as good a time as I have. It's always nice to have these conversations, especially when it's not necessarily the instructor model where it's like, here's your lesson for the day. We can just kind of have a good time with everybody. I will throw it out to the floor. Oh, Joe's got a hand out. I was just going to say, I'm going to throw it out to the floor for any last words of wisdom. I hesitate to say, or a joke, because I know John's probably got one.
No, I won't. I'm waiting for Luke to introduce himself.
No, I had a mucus question to.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
But it's kind of irrelevant, I know, to the group. But Monday night, I experienced doing 3 MRIs back to back.
Wow.
Roughly 2 hours and 20 minutes lying perfectly still. Now, I have the normal amount of phlegm production, and I cough once or twice an hour, not bad. And I lay down at night and I cough for about 5 minutes. Once I get clear, I'm good. But this was an experience that I've never had before, laying perfectly still. And I'm guessing you're going to say the mucus just keeps producing whether you move your body or not. It builds and builds and builds. And of course, I'm laying still, so they've got me on oxygen from the hospital. But naturally, it's shallow breathing because I'm just lying still. What's going on?
Well, you're exactly right. One of the best ways that we can actually mobilize mucus and start having that cough and all that sort of thing is to get up and get moving. I mean, we touched on exercise a little bit before. Cough and deep breathe is one of the things that we try to emphasize with people who maybe you've had surgery and you can't get out of bed yet. We want you to, use those sorts of things. We have devices like aerobicas and acapellas that can help break up some of that thing. But if you're really just laying there, it is absolutely, there's the aerobica. It is absolutely just sitting there. It's just pooling. It's just filling up your little air sacs in there and probably making it even more difficult to breathe and making it even more difficult to lay still and all that sort of thing.
Well, I had to keep not retrain, but tell my body or my brain, do not cough or don't even attempt to even make a sound, because that's going to throw off the scan and I'm going to be there that much longer.
Yep.
But when I finally was through and it was time to get up, it was a choking situation. That's all I can say.
Because you may even cough more than you realize. I mean, I was thinking to myself, I've probably done that 3 or 4 times now, and don't have the chronic bronchitis or anything like that. This is still just kind of the remnants of my illness. Because you're intentionally laying very still and you're intentionally avoiding any of that, you're obviously not doing it as much as you usually do, but you may even, it's one of those things, you might not even be aware of how much you're doing it. And then again, it just kind of piles up even more. So you may be even a little bit above average on that mucus production. And then when it all sits and then you kind of uncork it at the end, then it really comes out.
Uncork is the word.
When I get up in the morning, almost every morning, I can't breathe. All of a sudden, once I stand up and I'm out of bed, and I'm on oxygen, and then I realize it's because I'm congested and I'm moving around and I have to blow my nose because even though there's oxygen coming out of the cannula, it's not getting into my mucus-filled, I almost said snot, and I thought I shouldn't say that. My
You did.
mucus-filled passages, so I blow my nose ad infinitum until I've really cleared it all out, and then I can breathe. So that must have been horrible, Joe. I would have had a panic attack.
That's a
It was a
long
s-
time.
It was a surprise. Yeah. Because I was breathing fine when I was horizontal. And as soon as I got up, it was like,
Yep. That's
No.
when it happens, when you stand up.
All right,
Anyway.
we're gonna give Tom the last word here, unless we can finally talk Luke into saying hi. But Tom, what's on your mind?
Why is it something like a connector so important the way you put it on?
It's
It's
something
global.
called the Bernoulli effect, and has to do with physics, and I can't explain it.
And like John said, the small end goes towards the machine and
No, the small end
other way
goes
around.
Other way
towards you.
around.
Because what'll happen is as it goes from basically the big orifice to the little orifice, it will actually accelerate a little bit. The flow will actually get a little bit faster. That's it. I'm pretty sure it's the Bernoulli effect, like John was saying. It's been a while since RT school, but and then that again just kind of overcomes any extra, because remember, you've got
Friction.
the tubing, and then you've got this device that's kind of sitting inside the tubing and making that inner diameter even smaller. And that increases resistance, just like if you were to go into bronchospasm or something like that. So you've got to kind of accelerate that flow again to get it back up to normal speed and get it back to your setting. So
So if you start having spasms, Tom, you hooked it up wrong.
so well, we just switched them. I had one right and one wrong. And because I got one up by my cannula plus the 25 foot. I got one in there, but they should make these, if you splice them, they should be all big holes.
but then you might not be able to overcome that resistance though.
Well, you could
Well,
still.
they should be marked. They should be marked though. So I can tell my mother-in-law when she complains about
Yeah.
something, write a letter.
That's what they should do. They should be marking.
I'm gonna call my driver and ask him if he knows anything about it.
Yeah,
Question
absolutely.
him.
And
Yeah.
your RTs when you go to
Oh,
read
yeah,
them tomorrow.
there'll be more to talk about.
I mean, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, Mike, but did you knew that, right, or no?
I've known that for a while, but I did not know that back. I learned that I either through the foundation or I think I might have known about it. In my previous role, I worked in primary care. I was a volunteer with the foundation and was tied in with a lot of these groups. I can guarantee you that when I learned, I may not know when I learned it, but I guarantee you when I did, I learned it from one of you folks. I learned it from the population. I did not learn it from another RT or a doc or anything
Yeah,
like that.
me too. I was shocked.
Tom, when you talk to your RT about that, find out whether they knew that and let us
Oh,
know.
I'm gonna ask him. I'll
I
play a
just
game
don't-
with him.
I
That
I
sounds
would
good.
just,
I'm not
Don't-
gonna
don't-
directly ask him. I'm gonna play a game.
yeah,
Okay.
don't clue them in. Just say, does it make
Oh,
any
yeah.
difference
Oh,
which
yeah.
way it's
Yeah.
facing?
I normally do.
Interesting. Okay. I just want to know whether they know.
Right.
and
Take
All
Mike,
right, everybody.
Well,
Take
if they
care.
know, why
Thanks for
wouldn't
coming
they
out
say
today.
Yeah.
anything? Yeah.
Thank
Hopefully,
you.
hopefully
Lou.
see you again next
Bye.
month.
See you
Bring
next
some
month.
friends, and we'll see you at next month's Oxy Talk.